Hi, everybody. Welcome to week 5 seminar. I want to thank you all for being flexible with having an asynchronous week so that I could be away at this conference. If you have any questions about the seminar, feel free to email me. I will be checking my emails while I'm away. So this week we are going to be talking about gender. However, I was going to start with the feedback from your reflections and then move into terms that we should know and have a shared understanding of when we're discussing gender and gender-based violence. We are going to look into missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit, talk about the National Inquiry, and show you some of the ways in which we honor those girls, women, and Two-Spirited people who have not returned home or have died. We're also going to talk about how we can support gender-based violence, and in your careers that may look a little different for each and every one of you, and how it comes up may come up a little bit differently for each of you. And so we actually may need to have a bit more of a discussion around this when I am with you guys in person. And then we'll end with some reminders of what's in the weeks to follow. So, reflection feedback. Overall, it was really well done. I feel like most of you were able to discuss why you picked the chapter, what you learned about the myth, maybe what stood out for you. A couple reminders of what we need to continue to work on is making sure that you are following APA formatting, which means your title page has to be in APA formatting, your font needs to be in APA formatting, and citations need to be in APA formatting. So I did note in some people's comments, I might not have put it in everybody's. However, when you are citing or making a citation, it should be at the end of the sentence. Even if it's only part of the sentence, you want to put it at the end of the sentence just before the period, unless you are speaking to the author and then you're putting the year right after the author's name. And when we speak of authors in academic writing, we need to use their last name. Again, I'm just sort of giving this as feedback for future reference when you're writing papers, because as you write more academically, there is this expectation that you know this stuff. There were some minor grammatical errors that it might be worth like even reading out loud to yourself or having a peer read over just to catch some of those grammar errors, or even downloading Grammarly. And then my last point here is just to sort of allow yourself to critically self-examine yourself a little bit more and be vulnerable with the information that you're sharing. So when you chose the chapter you chose, and if you told me you were connected to it, what about that chapter is connecting for you? Is it personal? Is it work related? How have you experienced it? And with this reading, is that what you were thinking all along, or has it changed your thinking? And now that you know this information, what are you going to do with it differently? Okay, and that's sort of how there's a little bit of a difference of reflective writing versus other writing, is that you are allowed to sort of put in your own opinions and your own thoughts and back it up with your own experiences and how the information you learned either has changed or, helped you feel stronger in the ways that you feel. Okay? Okay, so we're going to move into those terms that we need to know. So, misogynistic is our first term, which is basically when someone has a strong prejudice towards women. And it may even be used in sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? interchangeably with when we are also speaking of two-spirited people, people who are gender fluid, because it's basically the prejudice and the hatred towards someone who is not man or identifies male. KMMIWG2S stands for Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women, Girls, and Two-Spirit. And when we're referring to gender violence within this presentation, you'll see it as an acronym GBV. And it's violence that's committed against someone based on their gender identity, their gender expression, or even their perceived gender. And we're going to talk a little bit more about it as we move into other slides. If you look closely, you will see that the roots of gender-based violence are all around you. And again, we're going to talk about that a little bit more because often this is where we need to do some unlearning versus learning, which I will dive into a little bit on in particular as we move forward in slides. And community, we have talked about several times already in the few classes that we've had, but it's that sense of fellowship based on relationships, having shared goals or shared history or shared interests. And in terms of Indigenous communities, it can be used to describe people who live on reserve, but also people who live in urban areas, people who are status, or people who self-identify. Intimidate or coerce, deprive, threaten, or harm another person. So this can take form in other ways besides physical. It can be sexual, which is also a form of physical, emotional, psychological. There's been a recent, well, maybe not so recent anymore, increase in cyber-based violence because people are able to hide behind their computers. But it can also be done more at a macro level by society, and can be economically also experienced. So it can also be the neglect, meaning the taking away or not recognizing of certain rights that people and women, specifically women and gender fluid, two-spirited people have, or being discriminated and harassed. These are all forms of gender-based violence. So while gender-based violence affects all people, some people are more at risk of experiencing violence because of various forms of oppression, such as racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, and even ableism. Certain populations experience higher levels of violence, including young women and girls, Indigenous women and girls, and people who are part of the two-spirited, lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer community. Also people who are non-binary, women living in northern and rural areas and remote communities, and women living with disabilities. And there is more risk if there is an intersection of any of two or more of the above characteristics. So if a person is a woman and she's Indigenous, then there is more risk. If you live in a rural community, there's more risk. So whenever we are more away from that sort of center of male, Christian, white, dominant culture, there's more risk. However, as we move forward in these slides, I also want you to consider that we need to be thinking more about not just that women are more at risk and the culture that we've built around protecting women, or women protecting themselves, but what's happening that makes predators, for a lack of a better word right now, feel that this is okay, what's happening in those areas in terms of on a structural level, individual level, that is allowing this behavior to even take place. When we speak to gender-based violence in association with missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit, we know that there has been and there continues to be an epidemic of violence. And often it has to do with the dehumanizing attitude that we have towards Indigenous people. And sometimes it can be the idea that it's invisible when it's not right in front of us, when it's being censored out of mainstream media. It doesn't exist. And when we highlight the things we do, it also takes away from what we're not doing. And so we're not always exposed to what's happening. But what we do know is Indigenous women experience violence 2.7 times more than non-Indigenous women. And the homicide rate for Indigenous women is 7 times higher than non-Indigenous women. So these are pretty scary numbers, and there's other numbers here that you'll also see. And we have to begin to wonder why this is happening, or not even begin. We actually know. There has been a missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirited inquiry, which we have been able to start recognizing and, I would argue, start addressing some of these issues. However, we could still be doing much better. So on this slide, you'll find a link that will bring you to CBC, which will show you several cases of women and girls who have been murdered. And you can look into each person, see them as the person they are, that they're someone's mother, someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's granddaughter, and read the stories and come to your own conclusions. Many of those stories, the families are feeling that the police did not do a good enough job, that there is some question as to why foul play is being ruled out or not being a part of it. And many of us would argue that there's some systemic racism. You might have heard the terminology Starlight Tours. I encourage you to look that up. It's not just about what's happening, but it's also the fact that many women don't feel safe asking for help. Many women, when they come forward, their character is further attacked. The system does not side with them. The system often supports perpetrators. So it's not just about the event itself. It's about all of, and usually it's not even necessarily one event. It's something that's going on and it's being ignored or not being noticed, and then we are not addressing the structural issues that go around it. And if you think about court systems, I'm currently working with families who it's really hard when the person who has committed the crime actually has access to better themselves, while the victim doesn't have that same opportunity. So, for example, when someone goes to jail, they start having access to food, often education, sometimes vocational skills, counseling, all of those things. And victims, unless they have connections within the community already, are often left to fend for support on their own. So in 2019, the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women was completed. And how it happened was families of the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls were met with and asked about their stories and were given space to tell their stories. And there was an opportunity to explore the intergenerational impact of this loss and the impacts of the violence. And here we have that question, what does intergenerational mean in this context? Well, sometimes it talks about, like things being passed down from family to family, but in terms of Indigenous culture, intergenerational trauma has often started within some sort of authority, within power. So it's happened by social workers, police officers, and so there is a mistrust in even at hospitals and doctors and nurses, right? So this further compounds the trauma and creates those other sort of forms of violence that I was mentioning in the beginning in terms of systemic and economic. So there has been attention brought to the lack of care that this received. There are 231 calls for action that was directed at different institutions, government, social services to start changing this. And again, it's sort of around what I was speaking to on a couple of slides ago, around that idea of unlearning some of the things we know. Why are we spending so much time protecting or teaching women how to protect themselves rather than exploring why men are perpetrating violence? Where is that coming from, and how do we address the violence proactively versus reactively? So at the beginning of this presentation, I alluded to that we'd be talking about how this gender-based violence might impact the work that you're doing, and it would look very different, likely based on the work you guys are all doing. Some of you are required to physically touch, some of you will be presenting medication, and having an understanding of not just gender-based violence, but having an understanding of how gender-based violence is also happening from a systemic level, and how it's hard to trust the people who are supposed to help is important. I would like to talk about this a little bit more when we're in person. It's Canada's secret shame, an epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Indigenous women face and murder 6 times the national average. Every time you come out to this river, do you wonder if you're looking at the line? Come across the regions you don't know for human or in certain perspectives. When it decisions Canada for its ongoing failure to address the crisis. The march is a simple message to the men who claim that they're being watched by the community. We see what's going on, and we don't believe that our people deserve it. Not discriminate. They watch anybody. Yeah. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is taking action. Those So, in attempts to sort of humanize gender-based violence and to make visible what has been invisible, one of the projects that have been brought forward is the Red Dress Project, and you will often actually see it here at Fleming when it's time, sometimes around the vigil, but other times as well, where we will hang red dresses to show just how many women, and often the story of a girl or a woman whose life has been lost to gender-based violence. It can be very powerful because, again, we're rehumanizing it again and saying we're not standing for gender-based violence. So obviously, because this is online, we're not necessarily taking a break, but feel free at any point to pause and then continue. So you've heard me refer to Two-Spirit throughout this week's material. And Two-Spirit refers to a person who identifies as having both a masculine and feminine spirit. Some Indigenous people use it to describe their sexual nature, their gender, or spiritual identity. As an umbrella term, it may encompass same-sex attraction and a wide variety of gender variants, including people who might be described in Western culture as gay, lesbian, bisexual, transsexual, transgender, genderqueer, crossdressers, or who had multiple gender identities. So basically, Two-Spirit could mean different things to different people, and if you're unsure of what they mean, it would be important to check in with a person if you want a deeper understanding versus making any assumptions. This video is not opening right now, so I will post the link separately so that you can view it. So as usual, I've gone a little bit ahead and I've already been speaking about a little bit of this, but when we're talking about gender-based violence, there are so many barriers in sort of getting support beforehand, and also so in terms of being proactive and preventing it from happening from a dealing with men perspective, we also have problems with accessing healthcare and justice and child welfare systems and education. Things like systemic racism, which I've already been talking about. So that idea that there's policies and practices that exist that support and help certain groups of people while at the same time also make it unfair and harmful or harmful to others. And so sometimes it's about what's being done, but it's also about sometimes what's not being done. So not necessarily exclusive to gender-based violence, but if you want to even look at our education system and how there's been a movement to put all kids together so that there can be inclusivity and nobody's being left out, which may be a step in a good direction. However, how are people being supported to actually make these classrooms safe for everybody? So there's an example, and I'm sure many of you can kind of go back in your own histories and experience about how many of times our support systems are the first things to be cut back versus things that were being given or done in a proactive way. Oppression is not that much different, other than it's not necessarily around racism, it's around oppressing a certain population that is not part of that dominant culture. Violence, even within those systems that help us. So if you look at when we ask for help from child welfare, that often a lot of pressure is being put on the mother to keep her children safe. And what are we doing about helping the dads be safe? and I know I'm being very generic in this example. However, I'm just trying to provide a way in which makes this very visible rather than invisible, and to humanize it. And then, of course, inequality. So we need to start thinking about how do we support a client that is experiencing some sort of gender-based violence, and that'll look different for each and every one of you, depending on your role, depending on the client, depending on the environment and the community. But in general, we want to be looking at it from an emotional, mental, physical, and spiritual way of looking at it, taking all four different directions and really thinking about how to support someone. So being present is very important, probably almost the most important. Saying something, even if it is, I'm not sure what to say right now, I'm not sure what our next steps are, but I'm going to be there and I'm going to figure this out with you. And when you don't know, learn. Find out what your protocol is. Find out if you align with that protocol. Support the human holistically, which is what we were just talking about. It means not just one way, like through medication. It's also looking at like making sure the person has informal and formal supports. And then one of the biggest things that I hope I've already been sort of instilling in you, if you didn't already have it already, because I know a lot of you are quite clever, but also looking inward before we really start talking about what others doing. What are we doing that contributes to gender-based violence? What kind of things are we saying or doing or ignoring or not recognizing that we could be shifting, even if it's not on the individual level with a specific individual? And then thinking about those ways in order to start supporting change. So this week you were to read chapter 12, and if you have, and I know we often do this in class and we talk about it all together, because we're not all together. When you read the chapter, I would like you to explore what it is you think Chelsea Vowell is expressing to everyone. How is the term two-spirit defined in our book? Why are two-spirit people most at risk for violence and most excluded from ceremonies and community? And why is it important to know how someone identifies when working with them? And why is it important to not place our views on gender on a person? So we can talk a little bit more about this when we're back in person week 6. So that is going to be the end of this. I know 30 minutes was a long time to sit and listen. So your LANS assignment, as a reminder, is due this Sunday, October 8th. And the following Wednesday in class, you will be presenting that to a group of peers. So not the whole class. We'll divide up into our 6 groups, and then between the 6 of you, you will share with one another. And then also, I haven't mentioned this in a while, but there is a quiz that needs to be completed by October 22nd. It can be done as many times as you need. You're welcome to use your textbooks. You're welcome to work together. It's just another way to help integrate the knowledge that we're doing. So thank you again for being so flexible this week. I miss all your faces, and I look forward to seeing you in week 6. Bye.